was strange because I was staying in London, so we caught the tube in to Wembley Park and walked, all the way up to Wembley Way, and then headed towards the turnstile. And normally you would meet a few people on that walk who you would know, or certainly see some faces of people who you would know. Occasionally have a stop and have a chat. I didn't meet anybody. I didn't recognise anybody. I'm not saying that's a particularly bad thing because new supporters, but you do expect to, you and I have been watching this team for a very, very long time. So almost exactly the same amount of time. So you do expect to meet the old faces, so to speak. And I didn't see anybody inside the stadium. I met one person, John, who a big City fan who used to work at City recently, the disabled guy, the guy in charge of disabled. I met him inside the stadium, but that was it. And yeah, when I went to my seat, it was a very odd atmosphere. No singing around me at all from minute 1 until minute 90. And I agree with you. I could hear, even though I was sat towards the City end, I was in the City end, but towards behind the goal, you could hear the Arsenal fans very loudly. They, were quite vocal. They were also vocal as I was walking to the stadium. And there was only a very little bit of singing. I think probably happened after City scored their goal. I could hear a little bit of singing over on level 1 in the far corner. A very, very strange atmosphere. Listen, I think our fan base has grown unbelievably. We've seen that in the supporters club, from when I first started doing this 20 odd years ago, we had 30 or 40 branches of the supporters club. Now we've got 370 around the world. So we've seen our fan base increase, and because of the whole situation with supporters, quite rightly, if that's what they felt they needed to do, boycotting the game, that opened up the avenue for lots of our other supporters who've never previously been able to get a ticket to go to the game. But it was, and there's an odd little part of that that's quite good, because it does prove that we've got a growing fan base. But it was odd. It was very, very strange. And maybe that's also a little bit why I was disappointed that we conceded a goal, at 102 minutes, and it was a big deflection, and disappointed that we lost on penalties. But walking away from the game wasn't as if I'd been to a game that had any real competitive edge to it. And I think that competitive edge comes as much from two sets of vocal supporters, getting behind their team. And considering there were 82,000 supporters in the stadium, the atmosphere, certainly from a City perspective, was quiet, to say the least.
You've mentioned the boycott, and obviously the 1894 group probably led that and stayed at home and donated to the food banks, which is a great thing to do anyway. And I'm sure that had a significant effect on the lack of vocal support in that end. But I think it's more complicated than that. First of all, we're in a cost of living crisis. City played in Istanbul, 8 weeks ago, 9 weeks ago, whenever it was. I feel personally that a lot of people will have paid for that trip on their credit card, just to be there at all costs. And they're probably still paying it off. I think that there are people, particularly of my age group and around about my age group, who've now starting to say things like, we've done it all now. I think I'll pick and choose my games a little bit more from now on. I think that's a factor. I think the club...
Yeah, I agree with that, by the way. I do agree with that, absolutely. I think, I think there are supporters who've waited all their life for this success. But now that it's happened, I think there are going to be supporters who think, well, I still want to go and watch my team, but I think the games that they select and go to will be, they'll think about it a little bit more. It cost a lot of money to follow City last year, and at the not to forget, we've still got a Super Cup game coming up in a week or so as well. We had Wembley, and the new season is starting. Financially, in the current climate, it's very, very tough to watch a successful football team.
Do you sense, because you have a relationship with the club far more than I do, that the club are sort of looking at what happened at Wembley and the way that things are going generally globally? You'll talk about the supporters clubs extending, and I've seen fans criticise that and say the club are more bothered about, servicing, if you like, the global supporters clubs and brands and stuff like that. Do you sense that because I've also heard rumours that the club would quite like to reduce the number of season ticket holders and have more, or at least not increase them, and have more casual supporters because they spend more money, and so they will, in theory, have been rubbing their hands together thinking we had a lot more people there on Sunday at the Community Shield who wouldn't normally go, and those people will buy more shirts and more expensive tickets and all the rest of it. Is there a bit of that happening, and does that worry you as a long-time supporter of the supporters club, that the club is changing? Because I thought it would change like this once as we grew, and it feels like it's happening.
It doesn't surprise me that's happening, and of course, the club want to be on and off the field the most successful team. They want to be the most successful team on the pitch in world football, and they want to be the most successful club off the pitch in world football. And part of that, of course, is to increase our global fan base. If we increase, and you covered it there, if we increase our global fan base, that means the selling of more shirts and more sponsorship, and more people are likely to come to the stadium and buy the higher price tickets and buy corporate and then do the club tour. I'm reasonably comfortable with that because, ultimately that's going to happen as part of, we've seen it with other clubs, haven't we? We've seen it with Manchester United and Liverpool and Chelsea, and and Barcelona and Real Madrid and Bayern Munich, and if we're going to be that successful, it's going to happen. We still do have a hardcore. I think you and I know. I think the real hardcore supporters that we have at this football club is around the same number it's always been, which is probably 40,000. On top of that, of course, we'll have a certain number of supporters who can only afford. So by that's covered more or less by the season ticket holders. On top of that, we have.
You don't think that the club are sort of, don't value those supporters who make that noise and the so-called legacy fans, of which certainly I consider myself to be, that they seem to value these new fans more than the legacy fans? Because I talk to a lot of people who say the club's lost touch. That there are suggestions I've heard too, may not be true. You could probably tell me if they are or not, that the club are considering doing away with loyalty points for away games, for example, or certainly reducing that proportion. And you sort of think, do they not realise how valuable they are? And surely that was illustrated perfectly by Wembley, because I can't imagine Pep, who is wanting the fans to make a noise and get behind them. He's always saying that. Would be happy. I saw Ruben Diaz during the penalties sort of turn around to the City fans and sort of go, come on. And there was no reaction. So surely are the club sort of taking legacy fans and diehard fans for granted? And will they regret that, do you think, if they are?
I don't really feel that they're taking them for granted. I mean, in terms of loyalty points, they've not given loyalty points for away games for a few seasons now anyhow. So
I'm talking about the criteria, that you have to have a certain number, and that helps.
No, listen, I think I don't think that will happen, to be honest with you. There's always conversations actually within the City Matters group about potential ways of changing the loyalty point scheme within the but that conversation has come from people within the City Matters group, whereas the club have always been quite determined to keep the loyalty point scheme as it currently is, because it does reward legacy supporters. They have changed.
Should the club, sorry to interrupt you, Kevin, but should the club have been alongside the 1894 group, at least vociferously? They might argue they couldn't do anything about the Community Shield being on a Sunday at 4:00. But should they have been at least seen to be not understanding the problem that fans had with a rail strike, the cost of living on a Sunday, rather than a Saturday? Would it not have been better if the club had been more active, if you like, in campaigning to try to correct some of this stuff?
Yes, probably, I think, to be honest with you. But although we don't know what goes on behind the scenes, and it's a really odd one, isn't it? Because I mean, the official supporters club, we didn't come out and ask for the boycott. We didn't back the boycott. But what we did is we absolutely supported the right of every single supporter who wanted to back the boycott. But you went to the game on Sunday, and I went to the game. So we wouldn't dream of turning round and telling our legacy supporters, don't go to the game on Sunday, because we've spent our whole lives going to the game. And for somebody to tell us not to go is the wrong thing to do. However, if somebody wanted to support the boycott, and the great thing about, even though we sold out and we sold out to a different group of supporters, the great thing about the boycott was it helped raise over £10,000 for the food bank.